If you've ever searched online for peptides, you've probably seen three very different types of sources. 503A compounding pharmacies, 503B outsourcing facilities, and websites selling peptides labeled research use only or not for human consumption. Those three categories are not interchangeable, and understanding the difference becomes especially important if you're considering peptides or compounded GLP-1 medications. First, we have 503A compounding pharmacies. This is the traditional pharmacy compounding model. Generally, a 503A pharmacy compounds a medication according to a prescription for an identified individual patient when a clinician determines that a compounded preparation is medically appropriate. These pharmacies are primarily overseen by state boards of pharmacy, although they also operate within federal requirements under Section 503A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And here's something that's important to understand. Compounded medications are not FDA-approved drugs. That doesn't automatically mean they're inappropriate or unsafe. It means the finished compounded medication has not gone through the same FDA approval process used for commercially manufactured drugs, and FDA does not evaluate each compounded drug for safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing quality before it reaches the market. Then we have 503B outsourcing facilities. These facilities voluntarily register with the FDA and operate under a different regulatory framework. They're subject to additional federal oversight, including FDA inspections and current good manufacturing practice, or CGMP requirements, along with reporting requirements. And unlike a traditional 503A pharmacy, a 503B outsourcing facility may compound certain medications without first receiving a patient-specific prescription, assuming all applicable federal requirements are satisfied. But here's another important distinction. FDA registered does not mean FDA approved. A 503B facility may be registered with and inspected by the FDA, but the individual compounded drugs it produces are still not FDA-approved products. What about research use only peptide companies? Now we get to an entirely different category. You've probably seen websites selling BPC 157, TB 500, CJC 1295, MOTC, ratitrutide, and other peptides with labels that say research use only, or for laboratory research, or not for human consumption. These companies should not automatically be considered pharmacies. In many cases, they're research chemical or peptide suppliers, and their products are supposedly being sold for laboratory or analytical research, not as prescription medications for patients. And that's a huge distinction. A research use only product is not the same thing as a medication dispensed by a licensed pharmacy pursuant to a prescription. The label also doesn't magically create a loophole, allowing a company to sell an unapproved peptide for people to inject. FDA has issued warning letters to peptide sellers after determining that, despite research use only or not for human consumption language, the products were actually being marketed or intended for human use. And this issue has become especially visible with retatrutide, which remains investigational and is not currently FDA approved. Recent enforcement and litigation have focused on companies allegedly selling retatrutide while using research-only labeling, even though the products were allegedly intended for consumers to use themselves. So when someone tells you, "I bought my peptide online, and it says research use only," that is very different from saying, "My physician prescribed a compounded medication that was prepared and dispensed through an appropriately regulated pharmacy." And not every peptide can simply be compounded. There's another misconception worth clearing up. Just because something is called a peptide doesn't mean a 503A or 503B facility can automatically compound it for human use. Federal law places restrictions on which bulk drug substances can be used in compounding. FDA has specifically evaluated a number of popular peptides, including BPC 157, TB 503B outsourcing facilities, and others, and the regulatory status can vary considerably depending on the substance and route of administration. In fact, FDA's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee met in July 2026 to specifically consider several peptides, including BPC 157, TB 500, KPV, and MOTs. C for potential inclusion on the 503A bulk substances list. So don't assume that because something appears on a peptide clinic website, it's automatically legal for a pharmacy to compound and dispense. Now let's talk about the GLP-1 issue. Semaglutide and Tirzepatide created another layer of confusion. During the shortages of drugs such as Wegovy and Zepbound, federal compounding rules provided circumstances in which pharmacies could compound versions of semaglutide and Tirzepatide that otherwise might have been considered essentially copies of commercially available FDA-approved drugs that dramatically increased access to compounded GLP-1 medications. But after FDA determined that those shortages were resolved, the broad shortage-based pathway for routinely compounding essentially copies of those commercially available medications changed. That does not mean every compounded GLP-1 prescription instantly became illegal. It does mean compounders have to comply with the applicable requirements of 503A or 503B, including restrictions involving essentially copies of commercially available medications. And compounded GLP-1 medications should never be represented as being FDA approved, because they're not. FDA has recently issued warning letters to telehealth companies over misleading marketing claims involving compounded GLP-1 products. So what's the takeaway? Before you purchase or inject any peptide, ask a few questions. Where is this actually coming from? Is it being dispensed by a licensed 503A pharmacy pursuant to a prescription? Is it coming from an FDA-registered 503B outsourcing facility operating under the applicable federal requirements? Or are you buying a vial from a website that says research use only or not for human consumption? Those are completely different situations. And don't confuse the words research grade, pharmaceutical grade, third-party tested, or 99% purity with FDA approval or pharmacy dispensing. A certificate of analysis may provide information about a sample, but it doesn't turn a research chemical supplier into a licensed pharmacy. If a peptide is intended to be used as a medication, my recommendation is simple. Know exactly what you're getting, know where it was produced, understand its regulatory status, and involve an appropriately licensed healthcare professional. Because when it comes to peptides, GLP-1s, hormone optimization, and healthy aging, education should always come before the prescription. If this video gave you a better understanding of the peptide industry, like this video, share it with friends who may find it useful, and follow me for more evidence-based information about peptides, metabolic health, hormone optimization, performance, and longevity. And remember, performance has no expiration date.